All statements and opinions expressed by guests of the Adult in the Room podcast are strictly their own and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or opinions of the host, producers, or advertisers. All interviews are presented in their most complete possible form in the interests of free speech. No statements should be interpreted as financial, legal, or medical advice. Listener and viewer discretion are strongly advised.
It's the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. That's me. Welcome to the Adult in the Room podcast with Victoria Taft. And today I have the privilege of having the chief White House correspondent for Newsmax, James Rosen, on the program. He's been everywhere. He's been with Fox News, and he's written for the Weekly Standard, National Review, and he's written 3 really excellent books, 2 of which I've read, but I haven't read the Cheney book yet. But let me just tell you what those books are. Out in 2023, the first volume of Scalia, Rise to Greatness, and the biography of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, which is excellent and insightful. Just so appreciative of this work. His book about former Vice President Dick Cheney is called Cheney, One on One. And his book about Watergate, The Man, The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, a biography of John Mitchell, the former Attorney General of the United States, Nixon's top advisor, we find out in this book, on all things, and the highest ranked government official to go to prison, and what we think we know about him, but really don't. And James Rosen, welcome to the Adult in the Room podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's great to be with you, Victoria, but I do have some methodological throat clearing to engage in at the beginning. This is called the Adult in the Room.
Yes,
as
sir.
Any of our viewers can easily discern, there are 2 different rooms here. Is it safe to say that we have 2 adults and 2 rooms?
Well, there you go. As it should be. Absolutely. Well, there's lots of stuff to talk about. You're in Washington, D.C. You're based there. Do you ever think about getting out?
It's sort of like the mafia, once you go in, you never get out. There are a lot of people who have, and my wife admires those people. I think my wife would like me to get out, but for the time being, I'm staying put.
It's a family business. You are in Washington, D.C. You are a chief White House correspondent. Can I just ask you a little bit about that gig? It was said that the vice presidency is no better than a bucket of warm spit. And I kind of wonder, sometimes I think about that with respect to the White House correspondents. And I think, my God, James Rosen is there. His talent is being wasted because all they do is basically it's a battery. It's the catcher and the pitchers. And there's not much going on there. So please enlighten me. How hard is this job?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. If you're serving as a White House correspondent during an administration that looks favorably upon your organization, your outlet, then things improve considerably. If you have a barcode of villainy stamped on your forehead, as I seem to have, walking around the halls of the Biden White House, it becomes significantly harder. But of course, I think what you were referring to, Victoria, was the dynamic in the White House press briefings.
Yes, true.
And there, I have almost entirely been shut out by Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, whose fitful efforts at calling on me really were kind of stop and start at best. And she has now not called on me since November, when under my questioning, she acknowledged the legitimacy of the polling data that has held the president's job approval ratings underwater for 2.5 years. And not only did she concede the legitimacy of it, but when I asked if they have any basis to challenge the accuracy of it, not only did Jean-Pierre say no, but she went on to say, and I'm quoting now, "We're not going to change the minds of Americans." I get that. And that was November, and that was the last time Jean-Pierre has called on me. And it was an extraordinary moment because here, after all, was the face of a vaunted communications apparatus, which is very well funded, maybe to the tune of $25-40 million a year, the White House communications apparatus.
Wow.
And it is precisely the job of the White House press secretary to change the minds of Americans when they believe the quote-unquote wrong things about your boss. And here was Jean-Pierre, in essence, saying, we're not going to change the minds of Americans. I get that. In other words, everything we've tried to turn around those underwater job approval ratings over the last 2.5 years has failed. Bidenomics didn't work. Getting out on the road didn't work. And so with that acknowledgement, in essence, Jean-Pierre said, we're going to have to stand for re-election without turning around those underwater approval ratings.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's why that was the last time she called on me. But I also just want to point out that the White House press briefing is an important event every day, both for professionals and what we might call lay people alike. But it's not the only means by which to do reporting on this beat. And in fact, I always tell younger people who aspire to be journalists and who in fact aspire not only to cover the news, which we need people to do well and honorably, but in fact to break news.
Yes.
That the way to do it is to get out of your beat, go someplace else where there's information, and then bring it back into your beat. There's a movie, I think it's called Heat, with Robert De Niro and Ray Liotta and Al Pacino. And Ray Liotta says, his character says at one point in this movie, to get down Broadway, Freddie, you don't go down Broadway. And that's true. That's something every New Yorker knows. If you're way up high on Broadway and you want to get to lower Broadway, you don't just sit on Broadway and take it all the way down. You get off Broadway, you go over to like the East Side Highway or the Hudson, on the West Side, and you go all the way down the highway, and then you go back into Broadway. And the applicability of this for journalism is that if the White House press briefings were your sole source of information as a reporter, you'd be failing in your job. You want to get information from Capitol Hill, from the State Department, from the Pentagon, from the think tank community, and then bring that information back to the White House and say, hey, instead of just rattling your tin cup, Tom Wolfe, who I got to know a little bit, the great writer Tom Wolfe, once said that the reason there are so few great British journalists is because it's such an undignified profession. You're constantly in the position, Tom Wolfe said, of rattling your tin cup for information. Please help me get even with NBC on this story or whomever, right?
Yes.
And he said that's why there's a lot of great British essayists, because it's not as undignified. But the key to breaking news, to cultivating sources, even in a hostile environment, which I'm afraid I would have to consider the Biden White House towards me, if you are able to not just rattle the tin cup, but call someone up and leave a message saying, hey, I've come across some intel on subject X. I'd like to run it by you. And if you have a track record of breaking stories in the past, that official will ideally be afraid of not calling you back. They will want to know, oh, gosh, what does Rosen know now? I better find out. And so, there's a lot of ways to do reporting on the White House besides just that press briefing.
And that's all we see. I understand. You do your stand-ups, or somebody in your shop does the stand-ups on the beach, as they call them, and that sort of thing.
Beach.
I just kind of wondered about that, how much room there is for enterprise journalism there. But if you're not called on, sometimes you don't get an opportunity to at least roll it out for a little walk.
Again, when you are asking questions in the White House press briefing, that is going to be your last stop, not your first stop.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah. And so would you say, who's the most talented reporter in that room, in your estimation?
Present company excluded. The two adults in the rooms excluded. Oh, gosh, I don't know that I'd want to single anyone out because that would look like I'm omitting others whom I respect a lot.
Sure.
But for example, Kelly O'Donnell, who's the president of the White House Correspondent Association, longtime NBC News reporter. We sort of came up through the ranks together. I have great respect for Kelly O. I think Peter Alexander, her colleague at NBC News, does a great job of questioning in those briefings. But there's lots of them. There's lots of good reporters in there. And gosh, there's different types of reporters. So, for example, there's reporters who get off on being able to walk into a party in Washington and say, I'm just back from the worst spot on earth, right? That could be the Donbass, or it could be Gaza now, or once upon a time it would have been Tahrir Square. I've never been that kind of reporter. I'm not the kind who seeks out opportunities to put his life on the line. I'm the kind of reporter who likes getting book contracts and going to all the right parties.
Sure.
And there's another division of reporters that we might make. As I mentioned earlier,
an honest man.
there's reporters who cover the news, and we need them to do it well and honorably. And there's reporters who break news. And then we might divide that into two subcategories. There's reporters who break news that if they didn't break that story, someone else was going to break that story. It was going to become known at some point, even if no reporter broke it. I'll give you an example of a fellow who used to be my office mate at Fox News years ago, a Texan named Brian Wilson. I think it was 2005, he broke the story that Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was going to retire on the following Tuesday. Now, if he didn't break that story, perhaps some other reporter would have broken it, or we would have learned it when Justice O'Connor announced her retirement that Tuesday, which she did. It's a great place to be, but the highest of the high holy categories, in my view, is breaking news where the reporter, if it weren't for his or her intervention, that news might never have become known at all. And I'll give you an example of that. The all-time great example is 1969, a reporter named Seymour Cy Hirsch, who at that time didn't even have a full-time job as a reporter. He was a stringer, and who broke the story of U.S. forces having committed a massacre in the Vietnamese village of My Lai in 1969. And again, back in that time, it was no foreordained conclusion that a story like that would come to light, but for Cy Hirsch's intervention. And so there's reporters who were really great at spot news. There were reporters who were really great at breaking a story that 5 minutes ahead of someone else. And then there's reporters who are great at breaking stories that, but for their intervention, might never have become known at all. And I think you've got different types in that briefing room and beyond.
Mm-hmm. And so, this brings me to one of your hobby horses, which I know is Watergate, and it's one of mine too, although you're much more learned about it. And you've written the book about the biography of John Mitchell, who has been castigated for starting everything. I mean, ordering the break-in or the cover-up or the cover-up. And you've set the record straight as best as you can. And Watergate has been a wonderful thing for journalists, and it's been a horrible thing for journalists. And one of the things it did was to introduce the idea of a wholesale use of unnamed sources and making stars out of individuals who were supposed to be doing their jobs and that sort of thing. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because you're obviously a very serious journalist and been at the pinnacle of the career. And I just kind of wonder what you think about that. I'm sure you've given it some thought.
Well, I know that Ben Bradley, who served as the executive editor of the Washington Post at the time of its Watergate coverage, later said that one of the effects of the whole episode was that, every local beat reporter covering some local state capital was determined thereafter, even when covering something as routine as a fire, to find that there was some sinister conspiracy involving the fire hose and that the fire chief himself was anti-Semitic. And there is something to that, after Watergate, and it extends beyond journalism in the law itself.
Oh, yes.
After Watergate, every county prosecutor had to have a public integrity unit so they could root out corruption, official corruption. And yes, every reporter after Watergate was determined to win their Pulitzer by exposing malfeasance on high. All I can say is that it took me 17 years to write that book, The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate. It was published by Doubleday in 2008. And it was always a part-time thing, I want to make clear. I might have been a little faster if it were a full-time thing, but I like to think that the 17 years were well spent. But, by the time I came along working on that book in the 1990s and 2000s, Watergate was largely considered an exhausted subject and one that had been thoroughly covered. And in fact, I was able to secure access to some 5,000 pages of Watergate testimony that had never been seen outside the government before. Executive session testimony taken by the counsel for the Senate Watergate Committee, so that when you had a big name witness, let's say like John Dean or Jeb Magruder, and I recognize these names are known to a dwindling few at this point, but these were the big stars of Watergate. These were the people who testified against President Nixon and his men and helped send them to prison. What you'd have is that that individual would appear on television on the Senate Watergate Committee hearings that that displaced all the soap operas for the summer of 1973. But first, a few days earlier, without any fanfare, they would be brought in for sworn testimony under oath in executive session, where they had counsel present, but they were only questioned by the majority and minority counsel for the Senate Watergate Committee. And no one had ever looked at that executive session testimony before, for John Dean, for Jeb Magruder, and others. And what it showed was that the testimony, the accounts of these Watergate conspirators, who were so central to the convictions of Nixon's top aides, changed considerably just from the executive session to when they went on television, and typically under coaching from the Democratic counsel. I was also able to secure access to 10,000 pages of the files of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, the Watergate Special Prosecutors, and their staff memos from their lawyers flying back and forth, which, again, no researcher had ever used before. And I found documents prepared by the Watergate Special Prosecutors showing that they knew their star witness, John Dean, was providing false testimony on a number of counts. In fact, one memorandum I was the first researcher to uncover was a Watergate Special Prosecution Force memorandum that carried the title, and I think it was 6 pages long, Material Discrepancies Between John Dean's Senate Testimony and the Nixon Tapes. Now, material discrepancy is a legal term. It means a difference or divergence in the testimony that is material, that matters, that could bear on guilt or innocence. Needless to say, this document, which had 6 pages worth of instances what the Watergate Special Prosecutors had tallied, where their star witness's testimony before the Senate was at odds with what they knew from the Watergate tapes, that document was very incriminating for John Dean and potentially exculpatory for the people that he was testifying against, John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's top aides. And that document was never turned over to the defense counsel. And just other examples where the Watergate Special Prosecutors would say, John Dean claims that he got this order for this overt act in the conspiracy for this crime from John Mitchell during a telephone conversation on date X, but John Mitchell's office and telephone logs support his claim that he never spoke to John Dean on that day. So either we will have to slide the date of this call to when we can find an entry in the logs that shows they spoke, or we're going to have to drop it from our case altogether. Now, again, that's exculpatory to John Mitchell. That document was never turned over to his defense counsel. So in all, plus the 250 interviews I did, the tapes I was able to get out of the National Archives, I was able to present what I say is not your father's Watergate, and a very different account, starting with the idea that, in fact, John Mitchell, as he always claimed, did not order the Watergate break-in, and my research showed that John Dean did. And it goes on from there. But it was an extraordinary project to work on for so long, but I think it still holds up.
Oh, absolutely. Let's pause there for just a second. You worked, since you worked and wrote for the Daily or the Weekly Standard, you probably crossed paths, of course, at Fox News with Tucker Carlson, yes?
Oh, yes. Still in touch with Tucker.
Oh, good. Well, he talked recently on Joe Rogan's program, and I wanted to show you an excerpt of this because now we're revisiting. What you did, those 2008, is now becoming more and more valuable to more and more people because they realize that, hey, we think we were bamboozled by Watergate.
I mean, if you look at what happened to Richard Nixon, which I, of course, did not understand at all, Richard Nixon was taken out by the FBI and CIA, and with the help of Bob Woodward, who was a Washington Post reporter who had been a naval intelligence officer working in the White House, working in the Nixon White House. And then he shows up like a year later, and he's this brand new reporter. He'd never been a journalist at all. He's a naval intel officer. The famous Bob Woodward, we all revere. And he's at the Washington Post, and somehow he gets the biggest story in the history of the Washington Post. He's the lead guy in that story. Well, I worked at a newspaper. I've been in the news business my whole life. That is not how it works. You don't take a kid like his first day from a totally unrelated business and put him on the biggest story. But he was. He was that guy. And who is his main source for Watergate? Oh, the number 2 guy at the FBI. Oh, so you have the naval intelligence officer working with the FBI official to destroy the president. Okay, so that's a deep state coup. What else? How would you describe that? If that happened in Guatemala, what would you say?
Well, what do you say? How much of that is true?
So I love Tucker as a friend and respect him, and am grateful that he has turned his attention and his platform to Watergate as a subject. There was an awful lot there. Suffice to say, I wouldn't agree with the statement that the FBI and CIA brought Nixon down. In his own interview with David Frost in 1977, which there was something like 28 hours recorded, 5.5 of which aired on national television in 1977, Nixon himself acknowledged that he had participated in the Watergate cover-up. He acknowledged that he had stopped acting as an officer of the law and more or less as an advocate for his aides and trying to keep them out of trouble. And he told David Frost, I guess a reasonable person could call that a cover-up. It's the closest thing to an acknowledgement of guilt we ever got from President Nixon, putting aside his acceptance of the pardon. And as he also put it to David Frost, I gave my enemies a sword, and they twisted it in, and they did so with relish. And had I been in their position, I probably would have done the same thing. So Nixon himself never, I think, maintained that he was entirely a victim in Watergate. Now, it is also true, and my book was among the first to show this in great detail, that Richard Nixon was probably the most spied-on president in modern American history. There was an episode that came to light during Watergate, but was sort of suppressed at the time, and which fell by the wayside amid the larger bombshells of the presidential tapes and everything else. But this was called the Moorer-Radford Affair. Tom Moorer was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yeoman Charles Radford was a 27-year-old Navy-trained stenographer and body man for Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council. And it ultimately transpired that this young Navy yeoman, Charles Radford, who is still alive, over 13 months during the Vietnam War, was working for the liaison office between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. And this liaison office had a little office over in the Executive Office Building on the White House complex and was run by two admirals who reported directly to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And this yeoman Radford, eventually under polygraphing, acknowledged that he had rifled through Henry Kissinger's briefcase while he slept on overnight flights as he accompanied Kissinger as his body man. He had rifled through wastebaskets and crumpled up carbons, and through these means had gotten his hands on 5,000 pages of classified documents and had given those over to the two admirals who in turn gave them to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When this surfaced in 1973-74, the Republicans on the Senate Watergate Committee wanted to publicize it because, after all, the yeoman was found out by the same guys who did the Watergate break-in, the plumbers. But to his eternal credit, President Nixon, who recognized that his presidency was already fatally wounded, forbade the Republicans from making an issue out of the Moorer-Radford affair because he felt that the uniform of the armed services was under widespread cultural assault in the year of our Lord, 1973, and he didn't want to add to it. In the year 2000, yours truly became the first person outside the U.S. government to hear the tapes of when President Nixon was informed of the Moorer-Radford affair for the first time on December 21, 1971, in a very rare Oval Office session at night with the president, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell. And Nixon was incensed, and he called what had been done here a federal offense of the highest order. And he demanded that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Moorer, be prosecuted for espionage. And John Mitchell, the Attorney General, who was the closest thing to a peer and a friend that Richard Nixon had, as was Mitchell's wont, puffed on his pipe silently for the duration of the meeting and only gave his opinion when he was asked at the end. And if he did, and again, I knew that this tape was coming out in October 2000, the December 21, 1971 tape. And I made sure to be at the National Archives early that day, and I was, of course, the only person there. But if you didn't know who the voices were, you could be forgiven for imagining that Richard Nixon was the eager aide and that John Mitchell was the president. Because when Mitchell starts to talk, President Nixon keeps saying, right, that's what we should do, right. And everything that John Mitchell said they should do, they did. And what Mitchell said was, Mr. President, I agree with you about this being an outrage. He said, it's almost as if these papers getting into the hands of the Joint Chiefs, it's as if they were coming in here and robbing your desk, Mr. President. And the chapter in The Strong Man that deals with this is called Robbing the President's Desk. But since Nixon and Kissinger and Mitchell were running foreign policy to the exclusion of the usual elements of the national security apparatus, including the Joint Chiefs. They were sort of like car thieves who had awakened one morning to find that one of the cars they had stolen had in turn been stolen from them. You going to call the cops? And Mitchell said, look, the idea of getting into a prosecution, we can't do that with all the classified material that would come out. But he said, I'm going to go see Tom Moore, Mitchell said, and I'm going to tell him this ball game's over with. And Nixon says, right. This yeoman, Mitchell said, we're going to transfer him out of here, and we're going to wiretap him for 6 months. Right, Nixon said, and they did that. And just to give you a sense of how quaint the times were, Mitchell said, it's also high time that we placed a security officer inside the National Security Council to ride herd not only on the bureaucracy, but also on Henry Kissinger. Right, Nixon said. So here we have the nation's top uniformed commanders actively conducting a spy ring against the president and his civilian national security advisor for 13 months in wartime. It's an extraordinary, unique constitutional crisis during the Cold War, and it's only one element of the spying on Nixon. CIA infiltrated the division of the Secret Service that operated the taping system. The FBI was assigned to provide round-the-clock surveillance, or I should say not surveillance, but protection for John and Martha Mitchell, the first cabinet couple ever to receive it because of the death threats they were receiving. And I got out the John and Martha Mitchell FBI files using the Freedom of Information Act, hundreds of pages, and they showed that every errand the FBI ran for John and Martha Mitchell, every time they drove them anywhere, they were reporting every comment that they made right up to the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, in whose handwriting we can see that he was annotating these documents. So you have the Joint Chiefs spying on President Nixon. You have CIA spying on President Nixon. You had the FBI spying on Attorney General Mitchell. And there's good reasons perhaps for this because of some of the maneuvers that Nixon and Mitchell pulled during the 1968 campaign with a kind of back channel to the South Vietnamese, urging them not to participate in the Paris peace talks, that they would get a better deal from the Nixon administration than they would from LBJ and so on. And this spying almost represented a kind of institutional reflexive response. But CIA was also infiltrating the committee to reelect the president. And one of the 5 men arrested during the Watergate arrests on June 17, 1972, was actively on CIA's payroll, Eugenio Martinez, and had been filing reports to his case officer in the CIA about the activities of Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, and the plumbers. So whether or not these elements took down President Nixon, I think is open to some question or to debate. But certainly Nixon was spied upon by the elements of what today we would call a deep state. Absolutely.
And a couple of assassination attempts on Nixon as well. I mean, there are things that occurred that we've not fully appreciated that happened to him. And it's all because of his foreign policy, yes?
I don't know that there were assassination attempts against Nixon. There were 2 against President Ford. Mm-hmm. But one other element in what Tucker Carlson was saying, I think also bears addressing. He was talking about the role of Bob Woodward. And he was talking about Woodward's source for Deep Throat, the number 2 official at the FBI, Mark Felt. And I've written at length on this and can post to my Twitter feed at James Rosen TV after this airs so that folks can see some and click on some of these articles. But it's true that Bob Woodward worked in naval intelligence, and that's where he met Mark Felt. It is not true, as Tucker said, that he went from the naval intelligence unrelated business to a job at the Washington Post. He had an interregnum at the Montgomery County Sentinel. But the truth is that Deep Throat as a source, if you look at all the information that was attributed to Deep Throat, both in Woodward and Bernstein's daily deadline reporting and in the books they wrote, a lot of the information attributed to Deep Throat was not only false, but wildly wrong. And in fact, one important tip that Deep Throat gave to Woodward, it's supposedly in one of their garage rendezvous in November 1973, turned out to be accurate. And that was that there was a tape erasure, a gap of 18 and a half minutes length on one of the Watergate tapes. And that was a very closely held secret at that point. Only Nixon, his secretary, Rosemary Woods, her lawyer, Charlie Rhine, the White House counsel at the time, very few, under a half a dozen people knew about that. Mark Felt could not have been one of them because he had resigned from the FBI in June of 1973, 5 months before this garage meeting. He simply would not have been in a position to know this about the Nixon tapes.
So who was Deep Throat?
Correct. And so when you raise this with Bob Woodward, and I've been in shouting matches with the guy, he dismisses these questions as mere wiring diagram issues, but they're not. And in fact, one person who's researched this is Ed Gray. Ed Gray is a journalist and the son of the late L. Patrick Gray III, who took over from J. Edgar Hoover as acting director of the FBI the month before the Watergate arrests. And one of the things Ed Gray did was, once the University of Texas purchased Woodward and Bernstein's papers for, I think, $2.5 million, Ed Gray went out to the University of Texas, the Ransom Center, where those papers are available to researchers, and he found Bob Woodward's actual Deep Throat file, which was labeled in Woodward's own hand. It was his own filing system. And in the folder where he has his typed transcripts of his interviews that he prepared with Deep Throat, one of the interviews is with an official from that time, still alive, named Donald Santarelli, who confirmed to Ed Gray that he had indeed been a source for Bob Woodward at that time. So from Woodward's own filing system, which includes amongst Deep Throat papers an interview with Don Santarelli, and from this fact that Mark Felt could not have known about the erasure on the Nixon tapes in November of '73, it's clear that Deep Throat was a composite source, but he wasn't even essential to the unraveling of the Watergate cover-up. The reporter who really was more essential was Cy Hirsch, who broke the story in January 1973 at a time when Bob Woodward was on television saying that he feared that the period of evidentiary disclosure in Watergate had come to an end. Cy Hirsch in January of '73 broke the story that the Watergate burglars and their lawyers had been paid hush money, and that really broke the story open. So the identity of Deep Throat is kind of a red herring, because the source himself was often wrong and couldn't have been entirely the person whom Bob Woodward tells us that it was.
Well, I think that, in this Mysteries of Watergate book that we've spoken of, the former federal prosecutor, John O'Connor, who did some forensic study on, what they knew at the time and that sort of thing. And it was basically that there was a real short shrift of all the CIA connections involved in Watergate, in his opinion. And he thought that there might have been more. He thinks that he was Mark Felt's attorney. So he thinks that Mark Felt is Deep Throat, but I think he wanted to, at least give a little more of a look at the CIA, and the Washington Post didn't do that. And he just...
another article I'll post on my Twitter feed at James Rosen TV for our viewers to check out is one that I published in June of 2022 on the 50th anniversary of the Watergate arrests. And it was called Revelations, Watergate at 50, Revelations from Newly Declassified Evidence. And I was able to bring to light there a lot of evidence that I had been sitting on that wasn't able to be placed into my Watergate book, and evidence that others have developed since President Nixon resigned, that showed that the role of CIA in Watergate was more malign and controlling than has been established heretofore. That is not to go as far as Tucker has and to suggest that Nixon was done in by CIA. But there was hostility to Nixon and Kissinger and their foreign policy among conservative elements in the national security bureaucracy. And so I think these are rabbit holes, and they're difficult to do justice to in conversation as we're having. But as I say, after our segment, you'll be able to find these articles on my website or on my Twitter feed at James Rosen TV.
Okay, I know we're running out of time here, and I just wanted to ask you a question about your Scalia book, and what an excellent book that is. I heartily recommend it. It's just such a great job on this telling of his life, and that's only volume 1. I can't wait for volume 2. But here we are. Here's a man who was part of the administrative state. This is Scalia was with a telecommunications group, office in the government. And here we have what may be the demise of the Chevron deference coming up in this Supreme Court. What do you think he would say if they get rid of all or most of the Chevron deference?
So Chevron deference is a legal term. It refers to And it basically, it's a 1984 Supreme Court ruling, Chevron v. NRDC, where the majority opinion was written by Justice John Paul Stevens. And it held that if the language in a statute is that exercises regulatory authority over an industry or what have you, is ambiguous, and the agency has made its own reasonable determination of how a rule is supposed to be interpreted, that judges, the courts, and justices are supposed to give deference to that reasonable agency interpretation. That is what Chevron deference is. And Scalia adhered to Scalia's first love really was administrative law, the law of the regulatory state. And he believed in Chevron deference. He didn't always believe that the Supreme Court lived up to it. And he was quite caustic of his colleagues when they departed from it. But my research for Volume 2 will show that Justice Scalia ultimately came to renounce Chevron deference as a matter of law, although we didn't have a chance to rule on it. But in his heart, he had come to a different view of Chevron deference. Mm-hmm. So the first book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986, is about 500 pages, and it ends, the last sentence, with him taking his seat on the Supreme Court. And I'm now at work on Volume 2, which will be called Scalia Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2016.
James Rosen, he's the chief White House reporter, or the chief White House reporter for Newsmax. And thank you so much for coming on the Adult in the Room podcast. And thanks for being an adult in the room today. Appreciate it.
Victoria, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Adult in the Room podcast. To keep the programs you like to listen to, please rate this podcast with a fantastic 5 stars on your Apple Podcast app every time you listen. And give me a great review. Plus, of course, subscribe to the podcast. It makes a difference with the big tech algorithm and the big tech oligarchs, and it makes us easier to find. Please get in touch with me on all the big tech stuff. Yeah, we're still there. Using the names Victoria Taft or the Adult in the Room podcast on MeWe, Parler, Minds, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks to 1A Cast for imaging, editing, and production. The fantastic song is Gospel by the March 4th Band of Portland, Oregon. Music for Antifa versus Mike Strickland is Ride or Die by Raps by RC. The Adult in the Room podcast is also a production of Flamingo Road Studios. Remember, head up, heart out, and strive to be the adult in the room. Till next time, mischief managed.